Lesson 23, Section 4, The End of Reconstruction. Most whites in the South bitterly resented the Southern Reconstruction governments. They hated the fact that these governments had been forced on them by Yankees. Many taxpayers also blamed their soaring tax bills on corruption, the misuse of public office for personal gain, by the South's new leaders. Although some Southern office holders did line their pockets with public funds, most, whether black or white, were honest, capable leaders. Still, when taxes increased, opposition to the new state governments increased as well. However, what bothered many Southerners most about the Reconstruction governments was seeing former slaves voting and holding public office. Across the South, Democrats vowed to regain power and return their states to white man's rule. Violence against African Americans. At first, Democrats tried to win black voters away from the Republican Party. When that tactic failed, they attempted to use legal means to keep blacks from voting or from taking office. In Georgia, for example, the legislature refused to seat elected black lawmakers until they were forced to by the state Supreme Court. When legal methods failed, whites turned to violence. Throughout the South, whites formed secret societies, the most infamous being the Ku Klux Klan, to drive African Americans out of political life. Dressed in long, hooded robes and armed with guns and swords, Klansmen did their work at night. They started by threatening black voters and office holders, and African Americans who did not heed their threats were beaten, tarred and feathered, and even murdered. The Enforcement Acts. In 1870 and 1871, Congress passed 3 laws to combat violence against African Americans. Known as the Enforcement Acts, these laws made it illegal to prevent another person from voting by bribery, force, or scare tactics. President Grant sent troops into the South to enforce these acts, and hundreds of people were arrested for violence against blacks. Those who were brought to trial, however, were seldom convicted because few witnesses and jurors wanted to risk the Klan's revenge by speaking out against one of its members. The Amnesty Act of 1872. By this time, most Northerners were losing interest in Reconstruction and the plight of the freedmen. It was time, many people said, to let the South alone. One indication of this changing attitude was the passage of the Amnesty Act of 1872. Amnesty means forgiveness for past offenses. The Amnesty Act allowed most former Confederates to vote once again. The effects of the Amnesty Act were seen almost immediately, and by 1876, Democrats had regained control of all but 3 states in the South. Republicans clung to power in South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida, but only with the help of federal troops. The disputed election of 1876. In 1876, Americans went to the polls to choose a new president. The Democrats nominated New York Governor Samuel J. Tilden as their candidate, and Rutherford B. Hayes was the Republican nominee. When the votes were counted, Tilden won a majority of popular votes and 184 electoral votes, just one short of the 185 needed for election. Hayes received 165 electoral votes. 20 electoral votes from 4 states were in dispute. Congress, which was controlled by Republicans, appointed a commission to decide which candidate should get the disputed electoral votes. The commission awarded all 20 to Hayes, giving him exactly the 185 electoral votes he needed to win. The Democrats threatened to block the commission's decision. Inauguration Day grew near, with no new president in sight. The Compromise of 1877. After weeks of negotiation, Democratic and Republican leaders in Congress agreed to a compromise. The Democrats accepted the Electoral Commission's decision, allowing Hayes to become president. In return, Hayes agreed to withdraw the remaining federal troops still occupying southern states. Once President Hayes withdrew all remaining federal troops from the South in 1877, Reconstruction was officially over. After that, Democrats quickly took control of the last Southern states. "This is a white man's country," boasted South Carolina Senator Ben Tillman, "and white men must govern it." Most white Southerners celebrated the end of Reconstruction, but for freedmen, the return of the South to white man's rule was a giant step backward. "The whole South, every state in the South," observed a Louisiana freedman, "has got into the hands of the very men that held us as slaves."